The silence did not dissolve gently, it fractured, not with a public confrontation, not with a headline confession, but with something quieter and far more unsettling: distance. When people began whispering that Tyler Perry was no longer standing quite as firmly beside Meghan Markle, the shift did not explode across front pages. It moved differently, subtly, surgically. There was no televised interview, no direct quote, no polished rebuttal wrapped in public relations gloss. Instead, industry insiders described a change in tone, an absence where there had once been visible support. In Hollywood, that kind of silence is rarely accidental. It suggests not chaos, but calculation. Not outrage, but exhaustion. According to conversations circulating within entertainment circles, accounts loosely connected to Perry's orbit began sharing an unfiltered portrait of Meghan. One stripped of branding, stripped of framing, stripped of inspirational narrative. These were not official statements. They were whispers repeated enough times to gain weight. The descriptions were consistent in tone, if not publicly verified. Difficult, status-conscious, sharply demanding behind closed doors. The allegation was not about high standards. It was about atmosphere, about tension that lingered once cameras were gone, about moments where tone and language, according to those repeating the claims, could turn cutting rather than constructive. Some claimed staff felt diminished. Others suggested that meetings could pivot from collaborative to confrontational with little warning. None of it surfaced in formal complaint. None of it was attached to signed testimony. But in Hollywood, repetition creates its own gravity. What unsettled observers most was not simply the behavior being described, it was the contrast. Public messaging centered on empathy, inclusion, mental health advocacy. The private narrative, as told by unnamed insiders, painted a more complicated dynamic. On stage, compassion. Off stage, intensity. That kind of duality, whether exaggerated or accurate, is what makes allies uneasy. Because once the possibility is introduced, doubt lingers. Then came the deeper tension. Some industry voices claimed Meghan framed many of her professional setbacks as systemic bias or targeted obstruction. Critics of that narrative, again speaking anonymously, suggested the issue might be more strategic than structural. In particular, one point reportedly created friction in private conversations, the emphasis on racial hostility as the primary explanation for stalled momentum. For Perry, a black man who built a media empire through decades of persistence, the framing, according to those close to him, felt overly simplified. Not because discrimination does not exist, but because they believe the industry is more layered, more complex, more dependent on timing and trust than any single explanation allows. None of these claims were made publicly. But absence speaks. During a period when Perry himself faced professional turbulence, observers noted a lack of visible solidarity from Meghan. No public endorsements, no overt gestures of loyalty. In isolation, that might mean little. In context, insiders say it mattered. One source described the dynamic bluntly. Support felt reciprocal when useful, invisible when complicated. That sentiment, fair or not, circulated enough to create narrative pressure. In Hollywood, loyalty is currency. When that currency appears conditional, relationships cool quickly. Then there was the story that had floated quietly for years, a private dinner at an exclusive venue. The version circulating now describes a tense exchange involving a server who allegedly made a mistake with a wine order. According to those recounting it, voices were raised, emotions escalated. The staff member reportedly left in tears. It is impossible to independently verify such moments. High-profile dinners are rarely documented in full context, but what gives the story traction is not a single event, it is consistency. Multiple tellings, similar tone, similar themes. That is what makes reputations vulnerable. Hollywood rarely reacts to one allegation, it reacts to patterns. Projects pause not because of confirmed scandal, but because of risk calculation. Meetings become rescheduled indefinitely. Invitations become timing conflicts. Calls go unanswered. Not out of cruelty, but caution. What makes Perry's shift so significant, according to observers, is not hostility, it is withdrawal. He was once considered a visible ally. He offered support when others hesitated. He provided housing. He vouched publicly. If that alignment cools, even unofficially, the industry notices. And once that signal spreads, it changes how rooms feel. The broader irony, critics argue, lies in the gap between messaging and perception. Meghan's public advocacy centers on empowering the voiceless. Yet the narratives now circulating focus on staff feeling unheard. She speaks of compassion. The rumors describe confrontation. Whether exaggerated, distorted, or grounded in truth, the contradiction is what lingers. Reputation does not collapse from a single story. It erodes from accumulation. from whispers that refuse to fade, from allies stepping back quietly instead of stepping forward loudly, from the slow realization that defending someone may cost more than distancing yourself. What remains is not explosive scandal, but isolation. A figure who once commanded unified support now navigating skepticism. A narrative once tightly controlled now contested. And in Hollywood, when doubt replaces certainty, the shift is rarely reversible. The deeper tragedy, according to those observing the shift, is not simply that Meghan appears to be losing influence. It is that she may not fully grasp why. She once positioned herself at the center of a cultural conversation, a symbol, a voice, a catalyst. Now, critics argue, she is increasingly becoming the center of turbulence instead. And turbulence rarely earns sympathy. It earns avoidance. Industry watchers insist that recent distancing moves, from international partners, from former collaborators, from institutions once loosely aligned, are less about punishment and more about predictability. Dubai's quiet withdrawal, they say, was not about image optics, but about risk management. The United Kingdom's continued coolness was not vengeance, but fatigue. Brands reconsidering partnerships were not acting out of bias, but stability calculations. Hollywood, above all, runs on pattern recognition. Perhaps the most striking development is not public condemnation, but public absence. There is no coordinated defense, no wave of high-profile endorsements rushing to counter the whispers. Instead, there is distance, strategic silence, a measured retreat that feels intentional. Some insiders suggest that when relationships begin to feel transactional, they eventually exhaust themselves. If every alliance is framed through leverage, mutual benefit, image value, strategic timing, then the moment benefit declines, so does loyalty. Whether fair or exaggerated, that perception has gained traction. Meghan built much of her public narrative around being misunderstood or mistreated. Now the counter-narrative gaining momentum paints a far more complicated picture. Someone who demands empathy, while, critics claim, not always extending it in return. Someone who frames conflict as persecution rather than disagreement. Again, these are perceptions circulating within the industry, not verified truths. But perception in Hollywood often functions as reality. Observers note that the rejections have not been loud. They have stacked quietly. Invitations that never arrive. Meetings that stall indefinitely. Brand conversations that pause for internal review and never resume. Silence, replacing attention. One executive, speaking anonymously in trade circles, reportedly described the dynamic this way. Work with her and you inherit her battles. Question her and you become part of the problem. Whether hyperbolic or not, statements like that reveal how fragile reputations become once doubt enters the equation. What makes this moment more charged is the apparent shift in her closest alliance. Prince Harry, once visibly inseparable from Meghan in public engagements, has appeared increasingly independent in recent appearances. Interview conditions reportedly tightening. Media handlers allegedly restricting topics. According to unnamed sources, he now avoids commentary involving her altogether. When a street journalist recently attempted to ask about rumors surrounding Meghan's past, reports claim Harry abruptly ended the interaction rather than engaging. Interpretations vary. To some, that reaction signals loyalty and protection. To others, it suggests fatigue, an attempt to firewall himself from controversy. Hollywood pays attention to these nuances. Staff experiences matter. Behavioral patterns matter. In an industry where word of mouth travels faster than press releases, how someone treats drivers, assistants, and service workers carries weight. Speeches inspire, stories circulate, and it is the stories that linger. The emerging perception, fair or not, has hardened in certain circles. Difficult to manage, quick to escalate, slow to reconcile, resentful of competition, reluctant to accept strategic missteps. Again, these claims remain unverified, but repetition gives them force. That is why the cooling of support from someone like Tyler Perry is viewed as significant. He once offered public backing when others hesitated. Shelter, credibility, access. If even that alliance appears to soften, the signal is clear to Hollywood: reassess. And reassessment in this town is rarely emotional. It is calculated. This is not yet a collapse. It is a recalibration. But recalibrations, if left unaddressed, become isolation. And isolation in a system built entirely on alliances is the most dangerous position of all. What happens next will not depend on tabloid noise. It will depend on whether trust, once strained, can be rebuilt before distance becomes permanent. What has insiders increasingly uneasy is not simply that people are stepping back. It is how quietly they are doing it. There are no explosive confrontations, no public feuds, no dramatic denunciations. There is only distance. Calendars suddenly become complicated. Emails go unanswered. Invitations fade into silence. In Hollywood, that kind of silence is rarely accidental. It is intentional. It is what happens when someone begins to feel like more risk than reward. The difficult truth, according to those watching the shift, is that influence does not shield anyone indefinitely. Power can soften consequences. It can delay them. But it cannot erase patterns forever. When protection thins, the stories that were once dismissed as isolated incidents begin to resurface. Assistants quietly compare experiences. Executives revisit moments they previously brushed aside. Staff members who once stayed silent sense that enforcement has weakened. People who once described Meghan as misunderstood are now, in some circles, using a different word, predictable. Critics argue that the conflicts seem to follow her. Collaborations reportedly grow strained. Professional relationships cool. In her own framing, she remains the target. In the counter-narrative, forming behind the scenes, others say they feel the impact. What makes this moment particularly striking is how quickly the broader narrative appears to be shifting without any direct confrontation. Meghan continues publicly framing opposition as institutional hostility or tabloid distortion. Meanwhile, executives are not debating ideology. They are evaluating volatility. In corporate environments, controversy is not always disqualifying. Chaos is. One anonymous producer, quoted in private industry conversation, allegedly summarized the concern this way: "Working with her means inheriting her battles. Whether that assessment is fair or exaggerated, it reflects anxiety about entering partnerships where grievances become part of the package. If logistical disagreements escalate into moral disputes, teams begin to tread carefully. Over time, caution turns into avoidance." Critics go further, arguing that framing every disagreement as oppression creates a defensive cycle that isolates allies rather than strengthens them. Supporters would counter that high-profile women, particularly women of mixed heritage, often face disproportionate scrutiny and hostility. Both realities can coexist. Systemic bias is real, and so are personal accountability questions. The tension between those narratives is where this moment sits. Meanwhile, attention has turned increasingly toward Prince Harry. Observers note subtle changes, separate appearances, stricter interview boundaries, a more guarded posture. Those close to him, speaking anonymously, describe not anger, but fatigue. For years, he positioned himself as her fiercest defender, confronting institutions, media, and even family on her behalf. Now, some suggest he may be reassessing. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly. When alliances repeatedly fracture, when collaborations consistently end in tension, eventually even the most loyal partners begin asking difficult questions. That realization rarely arrives as a sudden revelation. It emerges gradually, a pattern here, a repeated conflict there, a growing sense that every disagreement becomes a moral crisis rather than a manageable difference. If that awareness has begun to settle in, it could mark the most significant turning point yet. Because once the closest ally starts to question the cycle, the dynamic shifts fundamentally. This is not the story of the single scandal. It is the story of perception hardening, of industry caution replacing enthusiasm, of allies choosing self-preservation over advocacy, and of a brand built on resilience now confronting skepticism not from tabloids but from rooms once willing to believe. The future will not be decided by whispers alone. It will depend on whether recalibration is possible, whether reflection replaces deflection, whether stability replaces volatility, whether bridges can be rebuilt rather than burned. Right now, the silence speaks louder than confrontation. So what do you think? Is this a temporary recalibration or the beginning of something far more permanent? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. There's another story waiting, and you'll want to be here when it unfolds.